You said no. Clearly, calmly, maybe even kindly, and they kept pushing. Or they went quiet in a way that felt like punishment. Or they laughed it off like you hadn't said anything at all. And now you're sitting with this strange mix of feelings, part anger, part guilt, part exhaustion, wondering if you did something wrong by simply trying to protect your own space. You didn't? But here's what nobody tells you about that moment. The problem wasn't your boundary. The problem is that most of what we've been taught about boundaries was designed for a different kind of person, dealing with a different kind of relationship dynamic. And if you've ever tried to just set a limit and found it made things worse, or found yourself backing down the moment someone pushed, this video is specifically for you. There's a very popular idea right now. It shows up in self-help books, in therapy content online, in motivational quotes on plain beige backgrounds. And the idea is this: just communicate your needs clearly, and people who truly care about you will respect them. Simple, clean, reasonable. And for a lot of people, in a lot of relationships, it works exactly like that. But you've probably tried it. You've probably had a version of that conversation where you said what you needed clearly and without drama, and the other person minimized it. You're too sensitive. Or they deflected it. I was just joking. Why do you have to make everything a big deal? Or they punished it. A sudden coldness, a withdrawal, a comment dropped 3 days later that you somehow knew was connected. Or, and this one is subtle, they agreed with you in the moment, and then nothing changed. And so you're left with this confusing gap. You did the thing you were supposed to do. You communicated. You were direct. You weren't aggressive. And it still didn't work. Here's the first thing we need to name clearly. A boundary is not a request. This distinction sounds obvious, but most people, especially people who were raised in environments where their needs were frequently dismissed or negotiated away, never fully internalized this. When you grew up in a home where saying, "I don't want to do that," was met with disappointment, anger, or rejection, your nervous system learned something very specific. It learned that expressing a need is a social risk. It learned that protecting yourself comes at a cost. And so you developed a very sophisticated strategy for surviving that environment. You learned to soften your language, to add qualifiers, to present your limits as questions rather than statements, to apologize before and after. You got very good at expressing your needs in a way that made the other person comfortable, which means functionally you got very good at not really expressing your needs at all. And now, years later, you're in an adult relationship, romantic, professional, familial, and you're trying to apply the same strategy. You're trying to set a limit in a way that won't upset anyone. And you're discovering again and again that it doesn't hold. Not because you're weak, not because you're too emotional, not because there's something broken in you, but because a limit that's designed to make someone else comfortable is structurally incapable of protecting you. Now let's go a layer deeper, because this isn't just a learned behavior. For many people, the difficulty with limits runs right down to the level of how your nervous system processes social information. There's a concept in psychology called Vantage Sensitivity. It describes a trait where certain individuals are significantly more responsive to their environment than others in both directions. High Vantage Sensitivity people are more affected by negative environments. They feel tension in a room before it's visible. They pick up on micro-expressions, subtle shifts in tone, the emotional temperature of a conversation before anyone has said a word. But they're also more affected by positive environments. They flourish more deeply under the right conditions. They connect more profoundly. They create and think with unusual depth when they feel safe and seen. This isn't a disorder. It isn't anxiety, though it can look like it from the outside. It's a trait, a biological variation that was enormously useful across human history. The ones who detected danger early, who read social dynamics accurately, who noticed when something was shifting in the group before anyone else did. The problem isn't the trait. The problem is that this trait, when placed inside a relationship or environment that's consistently dismissive, begins to work against itself. You become so attuned to the other person's emotional state that you start managing their reactions instead of your own needs. You feel their discomfort so vividly that it becomes indistinguishable from your own. And so protecting yourself starts to feel, neurologically, like hurting them. There's a second concept worth understanding here, and it's called low latent inhibition. In most people, the brain filters out a significant amount of incoming sensory and social information before it reaches conscious awareness. This filtering system is called latent inhibition, and it exists for a reason. It keeps you from being overwhelmed by the constant noise of the world. In people with lower latent inhibition, less gets filtered. More comes through. More associations are made. More meaning is extracted from a single glance, a single sentence, a single shift in someone's posture. This is, again, not a flaw. It's correlated with heightened creativity, pattern recognition, and deep interpersonal insight. But in the context of a relationship where someone is consistently undermining you, it means you're processing every signal, every dismissal, every subtle act of disrespect at a much higher resolution than most people do. You're not imagining it. You're not being dramatic. You're seeing more than most people see. And the exhaustion you feel isn't emotional weakness. It's the cost of running that kind of processing continuously in an environment that was never designed to support it. So let's build a framework for understanding what's actually happening in these dynamics, because naming something clearly is the first step to moving through it differently. Think of it this way. Most boundary advice assumes a relatively flat social landscape, two reasonably secure people with roughly equal power in the relationship who simply need a clearer communication protocol. But many of the relationships where limits get repeatedly violated aren't flat landscapes. They're asymmetric. There's a gradient. And the person trying to set the limit is almost always lower on that gradient. Not because they're less capable or less intelligent, but because the relationship itself has been structured over time to position them that way. The other person has learned, through repeated experience, that pushing works, that guilt works, that silence works, that just waiting it out works. They haven't necessarily learned this consciously or maliciously. In many cases, they develop these patterns in their own difficult environments, and they're running them automatically. But the effect on you is the same regardless of the intention behind it. Your needs consistently yield to theirs. Your space consistently shrinks. And every time you try to hold a line and then back down, the pattern gets reinforced for both of you. This is why the standard advice fails for people in these dynamics. Just be more assertive. Doesn't account for the fact that assertiveness, in a relationship with an entrenched power gradient, often triggers escalation rather than respect. Just communicate more clearly. Doesn't account for the fact that the other person may already understand perfectly well what you're asking. They simply have no real incentive to change. Just walk away if they don't respect you is sometimes the right answer, but it's often said in a way that skips entirely over the question of how you get from where you are now to a place where walking away feels possible, safe, and real. The gap between knowing what you should do and being able to actually do it is not a gap of information. It's a gap of internal architecture. And building that architecture takes a different approach than most advice acknowledges. So let's talk about what actually works, not as a set of rules to follow, not as scripts to memorize, but as design choices, ways of structuring your relationship with yourself and with others that gradually shift the dynamic at its root. The first design choice is this: stop anchoring your limits in the other person's response. This is subtle, but it's everything. Most people, when they set a limit, are internally waiting to see how the other person reacts. If the reaction is calm and accepting, the limit feels real. If the reaction is anger, withdrawal, or guilt induction, the limit suddenly feels negotiable. What this means is that the limit was never really yours to begin with. It was always contingent on their approval. The shift here is to decide the limit before the conversation, not during it. To know in advance what you will do, not what you'll say, but what you'll actually do if the limit isn't respected. Because a limit without a corresponding action is just a preference stated out loud. It becomes real the moment it has a consequence attached to it that you're genuinely prepared to follow through on. That consequence doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be an ultimatum. It can be as quiet as leaving the room, not engaging with the topic further, reducing the amount of access you give. The size of the consequence matters far less than your willingness to actually implement it. The second design choice is to separate the relationship from the dynamic. This is one of the most useful internal distinctions you can make, and it takes practice to hold. The relationship itself, the history, the affection, the shared experience, is one thing. The dynamic, meaning the recurring pattern of interaction that keeps you feeling unseen or overridden, is another thing. You can value the relationship and still refuse to participate in the dynamic. In fact, refusing to participate in the dynamic is often the only thing that gives the relationship a chance to become something healthier. When you conflate the two, when refusing the dynamic feels like rejecting the relationship, you become trapped. Every time you try to protect yourself, it feels like you're destroying something you love. And so you don't, and the dynamic continues. Separating them, even just conceptually, creates a small but crucial amount of interior space. You're not leaving the person, you're leaving the pattern. And that distinction, held clearly in your own mind, changes how you move. The third design choice is to become more interested in your own internal state than in managing theirs. People who have spent years accommodating others develop a very strong habit of external attunement, constantly monitoring how the other person is feeling, what they need, where the tension is, how to smooth it over. This attunement isn't bad in itself. In the right relationship, it's a form of deep care. But when it's running all the time, automatically, in a relationship where it isn't reciprocated, it becomes a way of abandoning yourself continuously without even noticing you're doing it. The practice here isn't to become less caring. It's to apply that same quality of attention inward. To notice, in real time, what you're actually feeling, what you actually need. What's happening in your body when a conversation starts going sideways. Many people who struggle with limits have almost no access to this information in the moment. They only feel it hours later, when they're alone, replaying what happened. Building the capacity to feel it in real time, while the interaction is occurring, is what makes it possible to respond from yourself, rather than react to the other person. The fourth design choice is to let discomfort be data, rather than a signal to retreat. When you hold a limit and the other person reacts badly, there will be discomfort. Not because you did something wrong, but because you interrupted a pattern that the other person was relying on. That discomfort is information. It's telling you that the limit was real, that it landed, that something is actually changing. But for people with a nervous system that's been trained to treat their own discomfort as a problem to be solved by accommodating others, this feeling is almost indistinguishable from the signal to back down. Learning to sit with it, to recognize it as part of the process rather than evidence that you made a mistake, is one of the most important internal skills you can build. It doesn't get comfortable quickly, but it does get more familiar. And familiarity eventually becomes steadiness. Now here's the warning that most people skip over, and it matters enormously. When you begin to hold limits in a relationship that hasn't had them before, things will often get worse before they get better. The other person's behavior may escalate. They may become more demanding, more guilt-inducing, more withdrawn. This is sometimes called an extinction burst in behavioral terms, when a strategy that has always worked suddenly stops working. The first response is usually to try it harder, not to abandon it. This doesn't mean you've made the wrong move. It means the pattern is being disrupted and the system is responding. What you do in that window, whether you hold the limit or back down one more time, is enormously consequential. Because backing down during an extinction burst doesn't just return you to the baseline. It actually reinforces the other person's pattern more strongly than before, because it teaches them that escalating is what finally worked. Knowing this in advance doesn't make it easy, but it makes it interpretable. And being able to interpret what's happening, to recognize it as a predictable stage, rather than evidence of catastrophe, is what makes it possible to stay steady through it. Here's something worth holding on to as you move forward. The trait that makes this hard for you, the sensitivity, the attunement, the depth of processing, is not your weakness. It's the thing that makes you a profound friend, a careful thinker, a person who genuinely sees other people. The problem was never the trait. The problem was the environment it was placed in, and the strategies you built to survive that environment. Those strategies made complete sense once. They kept you safe, kept the peace, kept relationships intact under conditions that would have been much harder without them. But you're not in that environment anymore, or if you are, you now have the capacity to see it clearly and to move through it differently. The trait doesn't need to be fixed. It needs a different context. One where it's working for you instead of against you. The internal script worth practicing, not as an affirmation you repeat in a mirror, but as a quiet orientation you return to, goes something like this. What I need is real. My discomfort is information, not a flaw. I can care about this person and still protect my own space. Their reaction to my limit is their response, not my responsibility. I'm not managing their emotions. I'm tending to my own. I don't need their agreement for my experience to be valid. The limit stands whether or not they understand it. I'm allowed to take up space. And if you want to go deeper on this, if you want a more structured way to work through the specific patterns that keep limits from holding in your own life, There's a free guide linked in the description below. It walks through the internal architecture piece in more detail, and it's worth spending time with if what we covered today resonated with you. And if you found something useful here, the next video picks up where this one leaves off, specifically looking at why some people seem to push against limits in the first place, what drives that pattern beneath the surface, and how understanding it changes the way you respond to it. Not to excuse the behavior, but to stop being surprised by it. Because when you understand the pattern, you stop taking it personally. And when you stop taking it personally, you become almost impossible to manipulate. That's where we're going next.